Thank you so much for joining us on this Thursday, afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you might be. I'm super excited to be hosting Abby and JC from the Elate team, and they are going to be talking about the strategic planning and what the chief of staff role is when it comes to strategic planning. So a little bit about Elate. Elate is a strategic planning software built by and for strategy and operations leaders. A lot of us in this room, chiefs of staff, are often the ones who are leading strategic planning. So it felt like they were the perfect experts to lead a workshop on this topic. I'm going to let Abby and JC tell you a little bit more about themselves in just a little bit. But in the meantime, wanted to say thank you to everyone again for being here, and also encourage you to use the chat to ask questions along the way. So as Abby and JC are going through their presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll have a dedicated portion towards the end, about 15 or so minutes, where we'll pull you off mute and you can ask your questions in real time. But if there's anything that's urgent or you feel like you want a clarification, drop it in the chat and I'll be monitoring it the entire time. And we'll get started. So thank you so much, Abby and JC, for being here. Welcome, welcome. And I'm excited to get started.
Absolutely. I appreciate the intro, Clara. I'll start just quick round of introductions before we dive in. As Claire shared, my name is Abby Parker. I'm one of the co-founders and COO here at Elate. I get to oversee all things internal operations, but also get to work with a lot of our customers as well. So working with chiefs of staff is what I do on a day-to-day basis, and genuinely love it. JC, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is JC Lichty. I'm our Director of Customer Solutions over here at Elate. I also get the pleasure of working with chiefs of staff across the globe, and I'm excited today to talk a little bit more about the role that chief of staff play within the strategic planning journey.
Perfect. Well, without further ado, we'll dive right in, and I'll just start by setting agenda and making sure everyone knows what we're covering here today. Obviously, the main focus here is going to be all around the role that those of you who are chiefs of staff, or those of you aspiring to be chiefs of staff, would play in the strategic planning journey. But we like to start by just making sure we're all kind of aligned on what we're talking about here. So we're going to start with kind of defining that, making sure when we talk about strategic planning, and we use the phrase dynamic planning a lot, I'll explain that in a moment. Like, what are we referring to? And even more importantly, like, why is that important within the organization? And I think that really will tee us up to dive right into why the role of the chief of staff is so important in that process. We'll end with just a few predictions for 2023, what we think the year has in store, and then obviously leave a good amount of time at the end for Q&A. But as Clara shared, please feel free to ask those questions throughout. We'll be monitoring the chat. If there's ones that are specifically relevant to what we're talking about, we can answer them in real time. We can keep this fluid, but for the rest of those, we can keep those to the end and make sure we cover each of those. All right, so to start, I mentioned this, but when we talk about strategic planning at Elate, a lot of times we kind of refer to this as dynamic planning. And really the reason why we do that is because everyone that sets strategic plans at some point needs to transition into actually iterating on those. And one of the things that we've seen with traditional planning in the past is that if you set a plan and then you kind of like put it up on a shelf and it never changes, a lot of times you end up missing out on a lot of opportunities. And so when we think about the planning process, we often refer to this as dynamic planning, something that is constantly changing and growing. That said, when we think about that process as a whole, what we're referring to is an overall growth framework for not just building that plan, the offsite, those sorts of things, but also how you then execute on that plan. And I would say, arguably, most importantly, review that plan. We very much view this as a full cycle. But the idea is that when you're doing that dynamically, it allows companies to make those decisions more proactively, right? We don't catch ourselves on our heels at the end of a quarter, end of a year, all of a sudden surprised by the results of our plan. We want to be actually iterating on that throughout. So that is why we use the phrase dynamic planning a lot. But when we're talking about that as a whole, this is the journey that we're actually referring to. And you'll see that at the end, it kind of like goes up to the right with a little spinny circle, because this is something that iterates time and time again, not just on an annual basis, but frankly, even throughout the quarter. But generally speaking, when we think about this journey, a lot of times it's starting with just setting that strategic vision. And that process is often owned by a CEO in particular, or the leadership team as a whole, kind of setting that vision of where are we going. It then transitions into what most people think about with strategic planning, which is just that offsite. And that is a big important part. We're going to talk a lot about that, but it is not the entirety of strategic planning. So, from the prep to the actual offsite, A lot of times coming out of that, people then present that plan to the board, get their feedback, make sure that they're in alignment on the goals that were set, and then think through how we're actually going to expand that out to our team. So that's where we get into that department rollout. Many times this process is being done in parallel to or at different times, but usually in some sort of connection to the budget itself. We then end that process through talking through what we refer to as rituals. Those are the operating cadence, the habits you build in terms of how you go about executing on that. And usually that kind of pre-planning process ends with that kickoff, ready to kick you right off into the actual execution phase where you then continue on in that cycle. But these are kind of some of the more formal steps that we typically think of when we're talking about that overall strategic planning or dynamic planning journey. So this is what we're going to be pressing in on today. But I think it's important to start with understanding why this process is so important, why the dynamic function of this is so important, and then even more so why you all as chiefs of staff are so important in this role. And realistically, when we think about what strategic planning journeys look like for companies, for so many companies, this planning process looks the exact same today as it did 5 years ago. And there's a few things that happen when we don't iterate those processes. We see this across any process, right? Not just strategic planning. If it's not revisited and we don't continually think through how do we innovate this and how do we make this work for our business as our business changes, we see that what ends up happening is that we have 95% of company employees not understanding the high-level strategy. You'll see leadership teams set these visions, communicate them maybe once at an all-hand, but if those don't get revisited regularly, your team becomes kind of disjointed from that and quickly loses sight because what they're focused on is what's right in front of them, the most important priorities, those urgent things that come up, and they lose sight of that long-term high-level strategy of where you're going as a business. Additionally, folks often in the chief of staff role or in similar types of operations roles spend so many hours. We estimate across our customers 120 hours plus per quarter trying to track down updates and report on that plan. So you spend all this time and attention and frankly, a lot of resources up front creating it. But then what happens is it goes and then you're trying to say, okay, well, where are we at on XYZ goal? Or what about this objective? And if those aren't consolidated in a streamlined way, you end up trying to spend all your time as the chief of staff wrangling down and herding cats and trying to understand where everything's at and not time on pivoting and on doubling down on the things that are going well and on understanding where there are risks that maybe they're not off track yet, but they might be. And that's really where, as you all as chiefs of staff, that is like your superpower. We're going to talk about this more today, but you all get to be this connective bridge, and we want to make sure that the time is spent in that capacity versus just trying to understand where things are at. But the last stat here that we'll touch on is at the end of the day, when you don't iterate this process, what happens is that 67% of strategic plans fail. This is from a Harvard Business Review article. And I think that that number is really, really challenging, especially when we think about it this time of year, because February 9th, a lot of you all, if you're on a calendar year, fiscal year, are just at the beginning of that plan. And everyone has hope and everyone thinks we're going to hit our plan. But if nearly half of these are failing, we have to ask ourselves what's going wrong here. And so that is the number that we try at the end of the day to impact and say, hey, if we do this process well, not just the initial planning process, but actually execute and review on this well, we should see an increased number of strategic plans succeed. Alongside that, I will not be a broken record here, but at the end of the day, one of the things that I think none of us can escape if you've logged onto LinkedIn at all recently, or just simply existed in the world and heard the news, is that companies are having to focus more on planning and execution than ever before. So Jason, if you'll flip to the next slide, we kind of talked through this in three main ways, but none of this is going to come as a surprise here. Companies are having to face doing more with less or doing more with the same, maybe things they thought they were going to be able to grow in, whether that's staffing or even just resource allocation, is scaling back. But the goals are still there. We still need to push our companies and grow as an organization. But when we do that, and we don't do this thoughtfully, what we see is that employees experience what we refer to as priority fatigue. Maybe you all are experiencing priority fatigue. It's certainly not a far feeling for many. And the reality is this happens when there is not clear focus on what is most important. We get inundated daily with urgent fires, and every fire wants to be more urgent than the last. But the reality is if we can keep our focus clear on what is actually most important and not just the urgent, we're able to alleviate and make sure that we can kind of address this priority fatigue, not just within ourselves, but within our teams as well. And the last piece here, again, just companies can't buy their way to growth anymore, right? We saw a number of different ways that companies were going about that in the past. But as we think about the next year, 2 years, uncertain future here, we have to be able to think more thoughtfully about our plan and understand that the dollars we invest in any given initiative, we need to know the return on investment there. We need to know how those initiatives are panning out. We can't just say we're going to go tackle something and hope it works. So again, I'll kind of pause here from a why we strategic plan, what we're talking about, just to lay the land. And what we're going to dive into here in a moment is really then, okay, we know what strategic planning is. We all are in agreement on why it's important. But what does that mean for me as a chief of staff, as somebody who might want to be a chief of staff or a former chief of staff? What is my role in all of this? As I've kind of shared throughout, we think about the strategic planning process in kind of 3 buckets, but it's very much a wheel where they're continually kind of flowing one to the next. And those are in the planning process, the creation of that plan, the offsites, what we typically think of with that planning process, the execution of that plan. So how we then turn that into life and turn that into motion, start to execute and actually put kind of action to the words that we've said. And then finally in that review process. And as JC and I were kind of thinking through this question and talking with Claire about, okay, what do we see? Like, what roles are the chiefs of staff playing? There were really 3 main kind of, I'll say, titles that we're going to give to each of those phases. And certainly they're not just exclusive to those phases, but I do think that they're particularly unique there. So I'm going to start by just talking about the planning process, right? I'll let JC touch on execution and review here in a moment. But when we think about the planning process, a chief of staff is the conductor. And for those of you who are musically inclined, this hopefully maybe clicks right away. For those of you like me who are not crazy musically inclined, but have a good understanding, I've been to the orchestra or I've been to a show before. The conductor themselves is doing a few main things. The first is that they are setting the tempo. They are the ones giving guidance on, when to play, how fast to play, how slow to play. That tempo is going to change at different times. And when you think about that, how that translates into your role as a chief of staff in that planning process, you're the one setting the tempo on that plan. You're the one helping the team know what to expect. Many folks on your executive team who might be part of this offsite, they may have been part of offsites within your company before. They may have been part of offsites at other companies. But one of the things that's really important, and we talk a lot about this with our customers, is I'll use Elate for example. We have to create the Elate way of planning, and the chief of staff is who gets to define that. The chief of staff gets to dictate, hey, this is what it's going to look like. And it's really, really important going into that offsite that you're sharing and communicating with the team what to expect in that planning offsite, what they should come prepared with, what you'll be leading with. Giving them that direction is what allows them to play like a symphony in harmony together. That said, as you're in the offsite, there are inevitably going to be times where you need to kind of play around with who should be highlighted when. And we talk about this internally as kind of quieting the trumpets. And this is a task for the chief of staff that is probably one of the most important, but is also one of the most difficult. What we mean by this is when you go into that planning process in the offsite, there will inevitably be voices that are just by nature louder or like carry more weight potentially within that room. And as the chief of staff, one of the things that you in particular get to do is make sure that the loudest voice is not always the one that has the most weight. And that's not to say that whoever has the loudest voice, their opinion is bad, but it's to say that if we only let the trumpets blare and we don't ever quiet them to allow the flutes to come up, we're going to miss out on some really important parts of that plan. We're going to miss out on some really important details, really important inputs from those other team members who may not be the loudest, but have their own kind of view of their area of the business. So a lot of times it doesn't take long. If you think about your teams, you probably can identify who's the trumpet and who's the flute. And the idea is that in the orchestra as a whole, we need both of those, right? In order to create the best sound, we're going to need both. But there's going to be times where we want to make sure that we're balancing that. And so many times in the offsite, the chief of staff gets the unique role of just making sure that all voices are heard. And when needed, amplifying those voices that may be quieter. That said, if we take a step back, we go through that offsite, one thing that I will say, without a doubt, only the chief of staff can do is only the chief of staff sees the whole sheet of music. We talk with so many chiefs of staff, and I always find it's helpful to remind them that there are very, very few and potentially no other people within their business that have the line of sight that you do. And what I mean by that is a lot of times as a chief of staff, you're sitting right underneath and partnering with an executive or a partner within your organization, but you are inherently looking perpetually cross-functionally. You are not in your own silo. You're not your own department. And when you think about coming to that strategic planning offsite, you are the only one with that perspective. Everyone else coming to that offsite is coming and representing their own functional area and department. And so as you think about a conductor in an orchestra, they're the only ones that see the whole sheet of music, right? Every other person playing each instrument has a sheet of music for just their instrument, and that's great, and that helps keep them focused. But you get to see the entire sheet of music and understand how those different pieces play together. You're who gets to ensure that there is alignment, and ultimately who gets to then set the tone for the year ahead. And so as you're thinking both in that planning process and even coming out of it, I think it's incredibly important to remember that your view and your kind of understanding of the things that are going well, the things that are not going well, how there's a lot of interconnectedness and dependencies, that is something that usually only you can see, right? You get this vantage point that so many others don't. And I think it's often forgotten, and you almost assume like, oh, well, even my CEO might see that. But the reality is they're facing their own, they're facing their own sheet of music, and it's usually more externally focused or board focused. So not even them typically see with the level of detail and granularity that you do that whole sheet of music. With that said, when we think about this process, I will say, and I have to just give a quick side note here, JC and I were prepping for this and kind of talking through, the role of a conductor. We were actually Googling different conductors, and we're sitting at a coffee shop while we were doing this, and actually had a real life conductor stop us and say, "Are you all musicians?" And we were like, "No, we're very much not musicians. Why do you ask?" And he's like, "Well, I see you're looking up conductors." Like, I am a conductor, and he's a conductor for the Indianapolis Youth Symphony Orchestra. So we actually got to sit down, chat with him. I made sure that all of the analogies we were using here did in fact make sense. So we have his seal of approval here. But at the end of the day, we want to leave it kind of with this quote. When we think about the planning process as a whole, your role as the chief of staff, as you're seeing here, is not to be the ruler, but instead to be the ally of the players, or the allies of the various folks in that room, of your different department heads, of your different C-suite level members. It is your goal to guide that conversation. It is your goal to ensure that there is cooperation throughout, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to give you the best plan, not just a plan that's solely focused on trumpets or a plan that's solely focused on clarinets or whatever. We need to make sure that those things come together. And ultimately, what you get to create is harmony and unison, so that when you go out and execute, you're doing so with a beautiful piece of assembled composition and music. All right, with that said, I want to leave you with just a few practical tips on the actual offsite. So we've talked through what your role in that offsite will be, but there's a few kind of things that we always recommend when you're thinking about planning for that. And so some of you may have already been through this now that it's February. Some of you may have offset fiscal year that you may just be planning a little later or replanning. Either way, the first thing we will always recommend when it comes to the offsite is to get outside of the office if you can. There is something to be said about the space in which we work in. And if we are going into a strategic planning session in the exact same seats that we're sitting in on a day-to-day basis when we're dealing with all of the kind of urgent items that need our attention, it is really hard to allow our mind to take a step back and think creatively. When we think about this, you may say, hey, we're a fully remote team. That's totally fine. I still would recommend, if you're doing your planning session over Zoom, I would still recommend asking folks to switch it up. They may not want to leave their house. For me, it could be just leaving this office and going and sitting in my dining room. But I think that there is something to be said about the physical space. You hear this all the time, like, don't do work in your bedroom because your bedroom is for sleeping. Same idea here. We want to make sure that if we're saying we're going to have a different type of conversation, it's going to be more strategic in nature, let's change up that location to reduce those distractions and ultimately encourage people to be really, really present in the moment. Next is set a clear agenda. We talked about this in terms of you getting to set the tempo, but making sure that you agree ahead of time on what are we going to be accomplishing? What is it that you need to come prepared with? So a lot of times we will recommend giving some kind of pre-work to folks, but then what are we going to be leaving with? Making sure everyone understands as we get into the heat of the moment of the actual offsite, hey, at the end of the day, we're driving towards X, because a lot of times your role is going to be about timekeeping and keeping people back on focus. And so making sure everyone's aligned on that ahead of time is always going to be beneficial. But then lastly, I'll just say making space to think. And I talked about this a little bit with kind of changing up your location itself, but really what we're talking about here is allowing folks to free think, allowing people to get ideas out there and not shoot them down immediately, allowing people to say, hey, we're going to put every idea on the board and then we'll come back and revisit these, is going to allow you to get the best results. If people are scared that the idea they throw out is going to get shot down immediately, they will not share it and you'll lose out on a lot of really, really good ideas. So allowing that space to think and making sure that people understand that this is a time to be creative, this is a time to be strategic, and getting out of that day-to-day is going to be really important. All right, JC, I'll let you use that to transition then into execution.
All right. So we've talked all about the role of being the conductor as we think about the planning phase. Now we're going to move from planning to execution. So we're going to take off our conductor hat and can now put on the hat of the captain. So when we talk about this next phase, the execution phase, what we mean by that is now taking everything from that offsite, memorializing our plan, and starting to bring it to life. So this is where we will start to execute on the work that we just put to paper and start to provide updates on the progress. As we think about this time, the chief of staff is the one who is guiding the whole ship, and you are course correcting as needed. Like we did with conductor, there are 3 key areas of focus for you to navigate the ship as we're moving through execution. The first one is to provide direction on where you're going. You are the keeper of the map as we think about strategic planning. So again, you know where that end destination is, and your role is to get people to move in the right direction. So continuing to move to those top priorities that we set out for our strategic plan, but also making sure everyone keeps rowing in the same direction. It can be easy to kind of go off in silos. Again, your role is to keep bringing everyone back and providing that direction on where we're going throughout the year. Along with that, the second piece is to keep an eye on that dashboard. So very similar to the conductor, again, you all are in a very, very unique position. You see it all. So you see the whole dash, you see what's going on with everything with where you're going. And there are a couple things that you're going to keep an eye on. So like a captain, you might be monitoring the speed of the boat. You will be monitoring the speed of your strategic plan, looking at, hey, for these objectives that we set out to do, are things starting to fall behind? Are we slipping? Are things at risk? Or maybe the flip side of that, did some of these priorities start to move too quickly? And now we're blocked by another dependency or blocked by something else that has come up within our day-to-day. You're monitoring that speed and making sure we're keeping everyone on track to get to where we need to go. The second piece of that, as we're monitoring those system alerts, there are times where we may need to alert necessary crew members, or for you all, maybe leadership members or others on the team when needed. So again, if a new priority comes up or something falls off track that's going to impact other departments, we can alert the right people, bring them together as we're course correcting along the way. That takes us right to the third one of we are going to be navigating some challenging waters. As we can see in the image here to the left, there are going to be challenging waters that come up throughout the year. Things like new priorities that pop up that we weren't expecting. Maybe a new exciting acquisition or a market change or the pandemic that we went through, right? All of these things will come up, and you are the one that's going to be there ready to course correct and continue to guide the plan forward. So we're talking a lot about a map, how we get from point A to point B, and we talk about this a lot here at Elate. One thing that Abby has mentioned before, as we think about an analogy for this, is really thinking about our directions as we're driving in our cars. So if we date ourselves back just a little bit to the good old MapQuest days, where we used to print out our directions before we went on a trip, we'd be monitoring those. I know I would monitor those with my dad and tell him when we needed to do what. what happens is you always run into something, right? There is a detour or an exit's closed or a crash that has now caused some backup. And now we look at that piece of paper in our MapQuest directions and we're like, I don't know what to do now. We had this map, very specific points of where we needed to turn. And now how do we get to our destination? So if we think about that, now I want us to think about today where we use Waze, Apple Maps, Google Maps, whatever your navigation app of choice is, but these allow us to course correct as we go. I know as I'm driving, Waze even tells me when there's a pothole. They are telling me everything along the way so that I know here's the destination you want to get to. There are alternate routes to get there to ensure we're still hitting where we need to go. As you think about your role as a captain, that is what that role is. Going from MapQuest to Waze, putting on our hat and letting the teams know how we're going to reach our destination. With that leads us right into this quote. It's not the ship so much as the skillful sailing that assures a prosperous voyage. And that's what I think about as I think about the role of a chief of staff. You can have a plan that is built out really well with all the right components, but if we don't have a plan to execute, to evolve it, to navigate those waters, it will never come to life. It is the captain, it is you all that ensures that we get there and reach where we want to go at the end of the year. So let's take a step out of like maps and boats here and go into what does this look like for strategic planning? So as you think about your role as a chief of staff, providing direction provides clarity at the onset for our team to ensure we're setting up a plan that is able to react to this change. To show what this looks like, what you can see on the screen is this spectrum. This is a spectrum with how companies interact with change as it relates to their strategic plan. Like any spectrum, there are two opposite sides here. The first one on the left in green is what we refer to as set it and forget it. This is where we're setting our annual plan. Abby mentioned that we might be like throwing it up on a shelf every now and again. We're like getting out that dusty PowerPoint. We're like, how are we doing? Are we getting to where we want to go? But we're not having these conversations on a regular basis. And what happens then is that we're not adapting to the changing landscape of the world and environment that's right in front of us. And oftentimes we are missing out on opportunities. So we think about this set it and forget it. When we describe it in one word, we like to describe this as being very rigid. Now, flip side of that, let's go to the polar opposite on the right-hand side, which is what we refer to as the wild, wild west. So this is when we are constantly reacting to change. So still in this side of the spectrum, we set a plan at the beginning of the year, but what happens is that every urgent fire that comes up, we're reacting and we're moving and we're pivoting so much so that we lose sight of where we even wanted to go in the first place. When we talk to people that are on this side of the spectrum, a lot of times they describe it as feeling like they are just spinning their wheels, but they're going absolutely nowhere. The right-hand side of the screen, in one word, we like to refer to this as chaos. And like anything in life, we want to strive to find balance right in the middle, which is where dynamic planning comes to life. You can see there in the text below, this is where we allow individuals to seek autonomy through clarity. If you've talked to anyone at Elate, you've probably heard them say autonomy through clarity many, many times. And what we mean by that is setting a plan at the beginning with your team, providing direction on where we're going, but giving the team permission and freedom to pivot and adjust as needed. As needed is like bold, underline, the most important part of that sentence, because we don't want to set ourselves up for the wild, wild west, but we want to accept with our team that things will change and we should feel empowered to have these conversations about the risks, the blockers, and while this change should not be constant, there are times where we might come to a consensus as a team that we need to pivot. And if we do, we understand the implications, the impact, and how it's going to change our plan moving forward. So We've talked a lot about how we execute. So starting to bring that plan to life, how we are continuing to review it. And this takes us to that third and final phase of the life cycle. So no longer a captain. We are now, best for last here, the coach, as we think about reviewing our plan. So I hope that there are some Ted Lasso fans on the webinar today. I am definitely a big fan. If you were wondering why we were playing the music at the beginning, put me in coach. We were not about to talk about baseball, but this is because part of your role is being a coach as you are reviewing our plan. So when we think about that execution, when we were doing the work, providing updates on the progress, that is something that we're often doing weekly or bi-weekly. This phase takes us to that review phase where we are closing out our objectives, oftentimes on a quarterly basis, and we're reviewing the full strategic plan, which allows us to add that historical stamp to it and guide us through the future quarters of what we need to do. So you become the coach here, you become Ted Lasso, 3 things that we often see in this role. The first thing is all about studying the film. So I hope that you're picking up on this trend or this golden thread throughout all of these, that you are seeing it all. As a chief of staff, you are able to watch the game tape. You're able to find trends, areas that went really well that we can celebrate with the team, and areas of opportunity that we can pivot for the next quarter to make us stronger. After we study the film, we're oftentimes altering the plays with the team. And the one thing that I want to call out here is that our plan is not going to go 100% to plan. Things are going to come up, and we need to use what we've learned to make adjustments to ensure that we're continuing to evolve the plan. This might be, as we go into the next quarter, that we're altering some of our objectives or our priorities based on the success of the future quarter. Maybe we need to roll some over. Maybe we got more work done that we can adjust some of the priorities in quarter 2. This also might be things outside of the objectives and the priorities, but maybe altering or updating what we refer to as our rituals or our operating cadence. So how often we're meeting to talk about these? What does this look like when we talk about them? How do we have these conversations at the right time? This is where we can alter all of that as we're continuing to move forward throughout the year. And the third, and probably my favorite as we think about Ted Lasso, is your role is to encourage, celebrate your team, channel your inner Ted Lasso, maybe hang up a sign. It might not say believe, maybe it's your strategic planning framework or your vision on the wall, whatever you need to do to continue encouraging your team around strategic planning. When we think about this one, of course, there are going to be things to celebrate together, but also when your team feels like they lost a game, right? Or for strategic planning, when an objective falls behind or we didn't hit it. Reminding our team that where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish is done as a team. Like soccer, strategic planning is a team sport. So when we win, we celebrate together, but also when one falls behind, this is not on the shoulders of one person to help bring it back to get it on pace. That is a really, really critical part of this as individuals are providing the status. This is not a shame game or looking and saying, oh no, that one is at risk. That is all the responsibility of that one person or one department. This is why we have these conversations to say, great, here as a team is how we can bring this back. And having those healthy conversations is what's going to encourage people to continue providing honest updates early so that we can be proactive as we're reacting to change instead of what we see often, which is false greens, where people are saying something is green and at the end of the quarter, all of a sudden it's yellow or red, and we find out that it actually wasn't on pace to begin with. Again, this is a team sport. We are providing these updates so that we can all adjust on the fly as we're meeting. As we think about those times where things might fall off track, I think about this quote from Ted Lasso: taking on a challenge is a lot like riding a horse. If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. And that is a lot like strategic planning. There are times when it's going to get uncomfortable. We're going to have difficult conversation. Things are going to fall off track. But remember that those are signs that your plan is living and breathing and that this is a healthy plan. And as a coach, your job is to keep guiding, keep altering those plays, and really keep rallying around the team to get us to where we need to go. When we think about what this looks like outside of the soccer field, taking us back into strategic planning, this is what we think about as our reality. So if you look on the left-hand side of this, this is our employees' reality. This is all of our reality on the call today, where in that kind of jumbled mess there, we are constantly being hit with these daily pressures, both at a micro level and a macro level. Examples of these might be hopping off of a Zoom call and getting a Slack about this brand new idea or new feature that we weren't expecting, or maybe larger ones like the pandemic or the market changes that we're having. We're going to be hit with these pressures, and as employees, we are left to have to make a decision. What do? Do I run to the urgent and lose sight of important, or do I keep focusing on the work that we set out in the beginning of the year? This is where your role comes in. We take the jumbled mess and we move it to that kind of straight line there to harness that into streamlined execution with dynamic planning. We walk through those stages of setting a really strong plan. We provide clarity when we execute, and we pivot when we need to so that everyone knows where we're going, when to have those conversations. So when these things come up, an employee feels empowered to say, hey, I can focus on the important rather than running to that urgent. As we think about this leads us right into our predictions for 2023. And our prediction is that change isn't going anywhere. Change is inevitable, and we need to set ourselves up in 2023 to be ready to manage that change. This is where that chief of staff really comes in to make sure we're building a really, really strong plan. We have that transparency and visibility across the team at the beginning. Everyone has direction for where we're going, what it's going to look like to review these, but also what's going to happen when things pop up and how are we going to course correct as a team. As we think about our advice on how to manage this change in the new year, there are 3 key areas that we really want to bring home as we think about the topics that we just covered today and the hats that you will wear. The first one is, as a coach, don't get to game time without getting the team together to practice. Practicing is really having those healthy conversations throughout the quarter. Talk about your plan. Make sure everyone knows those priorities so that when we get to game time or when we have to make these decisions, we know what we need to do. The second one, thinking about your role as a captain, keep your eye on the plan. Monitor the dash, make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction, but be there to raise your hand or alert the right people when we need to turn the ship around if we start moving the wrong way. So make sure we know where we're going, be proactive with those so that we can course correct as we need to. And the third one, my favorite one, the most important, is please do not forget the importance of your role. Abby mentioned this earlier. You are the bridge. You connect the dots to the entire organization. Just let that soak in for a second and don't forget how powerful that role is. So as you're going through the year, not just in the planning phase, but throughout the whole year, continue to quiet those trumpets when you need to and bring out all of the elements that matter most to make that beautiful, cohesive piece of music and strategic plan as we move that forward. With that takes us right on time into the question phase. I've not been monitoring the chat as we're going through, but Clara, I will hand it over to you as we think about the questions.
Amazing. Well, everybody, please give a huge virtual round of applause to JC and Abby for presenting today. Thank you so much for sharing this. And I think having these analogies on the different roles that a chief of staff can play throughout the planning process is largely helpful to everyone. I wish I had all of these analogies and known my place a little bit better when I was a chief of staff myself. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Some I think have kind of been answered by our audience members as well, but I'm going to see, I see Nikki's question here. And Nikki, I'm going to ask this question for you. What has been the most successful tracking platform / program everyone has used or have used in the past to keep track of OKRs and KPIs? And maybe Abby and JC, you can answer this question from the different stages of companies. I think that might have something to play into this as well. So I'll let you take that question to start.
Yeah, happy to share. Obviously, I'll preface by saying Jason and I are a little bit biased because Elate is a platform that we find a lot of organizations leveraging for this process. That said, I do think stage, to your point, Clara, has a lot to say in this. We see a lot of the smaller your company is, a lot of times teams might start out with just using spreadsheets or some sort of like light project management tracking system. If you're working with just like a smaller set of individuals, that can be helpful. That said, as you think about strategic plans, as you go up market or kind of find larger teams, usually those tools are going to struggle with permissioning, being able to lock down things that maybe shouldn't be shared more broadly, or even understanding how to lock down more personal goals. I also think one of the things that we would always encourage folks to kind of be thinking about is when JC's talking about kind of keeping an eye on the dash. Objectives is one piece, but KPIs is the other, and bringing those two together is really, really important. So making sure, this is why we invest pretty heavily on our end of integrating with existing tools, whether those be your BI platforms where you already have some of those metrics created and set up, or your systems like a Salesforce, HubSpot, things like that. But yeah, I think as you get up market and you think, or you may be a chief of staff at a larger organization or one that has quite a few teams within it, obviously we would love to chat with you about leveraging Elate itself. But I think that is going to be size dependent for those of you who are leveraging things like a spreadsheets or again, a lightweight project management software. That might be good for the space that you're in right now. But happy to chat if that would be relevant.
Perfect. And I'm seeing a lot of answers in the chat, Google Sheets to start, Excel, of course, things like Asana or Monday.com. So there's a lot of different options out there. And I think at the end of the day, it's what stage is your company at? What are people already comfortable using? You don't want the upfront cost of somebody learning a new software to actually be the barrier to getting to the actual meat of the strategic planning. And then as your company grows, it's going to make sense to maybe swap to something that is going to encompass more of the things that Abby mentioned, integrations across different data platforms and things like that. Great question here from Julie. Julie asks, I've noticed with some larger companies, they will have a chief of staff position across different executives. How do you see these roles play out when there are multiple chief of staff employees? Does that impact seeing the quote unquote full sheet of music?
It's a great question. JC, I can start, but feel free to add anything I might miss here because I know you've worked with a number of different teams where this is the case. It's a really good question. So as they share, those larger organizations, you will start to see chiefs of staff for different kind of either functional areas, or sometimes you'll even see kind of an overall organization with multiple kind of sub entities underneath it. And I think that one of the things that's really, really important when that happens is that chiefs of staff, regardless of what team they're on, are meeting regularly to ensure that you're able to continue to see the whole sheet of music. No matter if your team has 3 teams in it or 30, the reality is that the work that happens within one team never only impacts that team, right? Those teams exist because they're actually all working together. And so even if you are just the chief of staff over a specific segment of the business and there's another chief of staff over maybe more of like the revenue side, you two need to be working in concert to ensure that you're able to see the entirety of that sheet of music, because you need to know what's coming. You need to know what's coming out of your entity that might affect others. And so you're spot on that you will see multiple chiefs of staff, but usually that's a great opportunity for those folks to either create some sort of like transformation office or some sort of regular meeting where those folks are getting together and making sure that they're chatting understanding what's going on within those organizations. Because again, the things that we do within one department impact everyone. It may take longer to impact some orgs than others, but they do eventually impact everyone.
And I think, Brett, there, your comment is spot on as we think about maybe owning your own sheet of music. But as Abby mentioned, making sure that those are connected and they are not living in silos. So knowing how is my work dependent upon yours, so everyone is continuing to talk as we think about the larger conductor, as you mentioned, Brett, having that full sheet.
Mm-hmm.
One question that I wanted to bring in here. So you mentioned a lot about dynamic planning, which I really love using that phrase over, just strategic planning, which feels like a very one-off type thing. But I think one maybe issue or barrier that a lot of chiefs of staff run into is how do we get to that cadence where we're checking in constantly when it usually is like a once every quarter type thing, or even like once a year. So how do you move from a less frequent check-in to something like a more weekly objective check-in? Do you have any recommendations on how folks might want to help steer their org in those directions?
JC, I can let you run with that one.
Yeah. So I think as we think about that one as well, the one thing that we will always talk about is meeting you where you are at. So we like to look at what meetings are you already having today and what do those look like? What we want to do is avoid those more quarterly updates. When we find that happens, people are oftentimes writing a novel about what happened in the past month or past few weeks. And what happens is we're really reactive where we weren't able to catch that sooner. So thinking about, great, how do we maybe start going into this on a monthly basis if that's a cadence that you already meet at, or even bi-weekly? So aligning it with where your executive team is already meeting and saying, how do we align to provide the right information so we're having those conversations, being a little more efficient and effective with the time that we have together.
Perfect. And I have a question here from EPEC or IPEC. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but they ask, to what extent does the whole team need to be informed about strategic planning? I think this is a great question when it comes to, how involved should every single person be, or who should be really involved? The question goes on to ask, in other words, how do you show the big picture during dynamic planning and keep the transparency but not confuse everyone?
That's a really, really good question. And that spectrum slide that JC was showing earlier, I think is really starts to hit on this. But by default, we strongly recommend being more transparent with teams than less. I think that sometimes we worry that folks are not going to understand it, or they won't know how we got to those pieces. And that may be true. And we may want to add opportunity for them to ask questions. But generally speaking, we tend to recommend sharing the strategic plan more broadly with the team, but you want to do so in an organized way. So JC mentioned a few times this concept of like a framework. For those of you who leverage OKRs or EOS or V2MOM, you probably have this framework. I will say, regardless of what your framework is, there's kind of some key components there. Within our team, what we typically recommend is you start with your mission, vision, and values. Those are your North Star. That is where you are always going and driving towards as an organization. As you take that one layer down, we usually see teams use what we call themes. You may call these strategic pillars, rallying cries, something like that. But these are typically set at an annual basis. Sometimes they'll carry over one year to the next, but they're usually not changed more frequently than annually. And these are kind of your guiding principles of where you're going that year. So we almost always see one around growing revenue. We often see one around, especially right now, building value within your customer base or delivering value to your customers. Usually there's one around creating a best-in-class culture. Either way, those themes are kind of higher level. They're intentionally more vague than an objective itself because they're giving you guidance on where you're going. So you got your mission, vision, values, your themes, and then right under that is where your objectives live. And those are going to be more specific. They might be set at an annual basis or a quarterly basis. They're a little more specific in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And then you have the key results to say, here's how we're going to measure it. When you give folks that framework, I think it helps them to latch on to things because when they think about the themes, they know that those aren't changing. You're not going to change the themes mid-year. What may change is how you accomplish those themes. You may say, hey, in Q1, we are going to do X. And then as you get to the end of Q1, you may realize that you need to pivot that, and that instead of going on to Y, you may go to X part 2 instead and kind of change a little bit there. We want to keep teams informed regularly. So I do recommend revisiting the high level strategic initiatives or objectives at least some sort of all hands cadence, like a quarterly or even monthly. Honestly, for all hands is helpful. But we do find that giving them transparency and visibility to go see where those things are at any given time is really, really important. So again, whether you're leveraging Elate or a different system, giving folks transparency into that, I think actually allows them to have that autonomy through clarity. They know where they're headed and they can help make the decisions on how their role needs to pivot to ensure that you get there.
Thanks for that, Abby. That was super in-depth and very helpful. Clearly, you are the experts in this field. I have an add-on question to that question from Brett. So what mechanisms can help a chief of staff hold leaders accountable to these plans when we don't technically manage or have the quote unquote power to hold them accountable? So I think something that's interesting is that in the roles that you are comparing chiefs of staff to, right? The conductor, the coach, these often feel like people who are in that role of power. But, in an org, perhaps chief of staff doesn't necessarily sit at that C-suite. So what can a chief of staff do to drive that accountability?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, JC.
I was going to say a couple things come to mind here. And the first one is when we are building that plan, making sure we have buy-in from the start. And a couple things with that. One, we talk about accountability to have these plans or get some of these updates on a regular basis. We first want to start and ensure that we define ownership across our plan. So we know who is responsible for updating what. So there aren't kind of missed wires as we go and start executing on the plan. And now we don't have an update somewhere because that individual didn't know they were responsible for providing that. So it starts in building that really strong and healthy plan. The second piece of that, kind of coming back to what we talked about, is starting to have that regular basis to meet. We refer to those as rituals or setting that operating cadence. And this is something that at the very beginning of the year, it's great to kick off the year and say, here's what our rituals will be, and getting buy-in across the leadership team on these rituals. So there are 4 key rituals that we recommend. The first one is, how often are we going to provide an update on these? Again, weekly, bi-weekly is what we typically recommend, but we meet you where you're at in your current cadence. And then how often are we going to review those? If we are not reviewing the updates and doing something with that information, people will stop providing the updates. So making sure we're having that constant circle of when we get the information, we know how we're going to talk about it and what we're going to do with it. Third one is the fire drill. What we refer to as when that shiny item comes up or that new priority, what are we going to do as a team to come together and talk about this? We call that flagging that in the moment, tagging and alerting the right members across the team to have that conversation and how it's going to impact our plan and the decision that we're going to make. And then the final piece that we talked about is how are we going to review those? So you talked about, would this be with WBRs? What are we going to do there? But coming back to those on that regular cadence of what did that look like, closing it out, having that stamp and moving forward.
Perfect. Well, I think we are just at the top of the hour here. So I want to give everyone the chance to let you know that we are going to send out the slides and the recording of this. So don't worry if there are questions or you want to use the Ted Lasso slide to present to your team and say, this is my role in strategic planning. Abby and JC, will you give a quick overview on Elate and what that looks like if people wanted to follow up with you afterwards? I'm going to drop all of our LinkedIns here in the chat so you connect with all of us, but give us a quick overview if any of these aspiring or former or current chiefs of staff are interested in checking out Elate.
Yeah, absolutely. At Elate, we help people marry that long-term vision with the tactical execution. There's a big gap there. Our software helps to plug into that gap, not only help you with the planning process, but then turn that into execution, as JC's talking about these rituals. Those are all things that we help automate within our system to ensure that folks are getting those regular reminders to go in, provide those check-ins. Everyone can go to the same place to see where you're at on that plan. So obviously we'd love to chat with you all if that's of interest or of need for any of you, or if that's speaking to a pain that you might feel. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn, or our website is just goelate.com. So feel free to reach out to us there. We do offer both the software side, but we also, JC's role kind of helps own the services side as well. So a lot of times we are working in concert and partnership, helping audit, review those plans, provide suggestions as well, all within the Elate umbrella.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this Thursday. It was so great to see all of you virtually, and stay tuned for some more workshops coming up in the next couple of weeks. Hope everybody has a wonderful start to their weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everyone.